5:14 a.m. Commerce Street, East Nashville. The alarm didn't wake Matthew Miller. He had been lying on his back for 11 minutes already, eyes open, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of his apartment. The one that looked, if you tilted your head just right, like a topographic map of eastern Afghanistan. He had never mentioned that to anyone. It felt like the kind of thing that, if said out loud, would require a follow-up conversation he didn't have the energy for. He sat up slowly, not from stiffness. His body was still a precision instrument, still woke each morning like a machine cycling through its startup sequence, but from habit, deliberate, controlled. He'd learned a long time ago that the moments right after waking were when your mind was most honest with you, and he didn't want to rush past them. The apartment was on the third floor of a converted textile warehouse in East Nashville. High ceilings, exposed brick, original iron radiators that clanked and groaned through the Tennessee winters like old soldiers complaining about their knees. He'd chosen it for the sidelines. 3 windows facing the street, 1 facing the alley, a stairwell he'd already mentally mapped for egress, and a neighbor, a retired postal worker named Carl, who kept predictable hours and minded his own business. Matt liked people who minded their own business. Morning inventory. He swung his legs off the bed and sat at the edge for a moment, feet flat on the cold hardwood floor. 36 years old. He ran through the inventory the way he always did. Shoulders good. Left knee a 3 out of 10. The scar along his right forearm still pulling slightly in the cold. Not bad. He'd woken up in worse shape in places that made this apartment look like a resort. He stood and walked to the window without turning on any lights. 3 floors down, Commerce Street was still dark and mostly empty. A city bus idled at the far corner, its interior glow casting a yellow rectangle on the wet asphalt. A woman in scrubs walked briskly toward the hospital 2 blocks east, her breath fogging in the November air. A man in an orange vest leaned against a utility truck, scrolling his phone. Matt watched for 45 seconds, long enough to establish pattern, short enough that it wasn't a problem, and then moved to the kitchen. Coffee first. Always coffee first. The ritual was precise. 3 scoops of dark roast, a specific brand he ordered in bulk from a small roaster in Vermont. Filtered water that he'd let sit overnight to reach room temperature before it hit the machine. He'd picked up that last detail from a paper he'd read during his second year of doctoral coursework, something about dissolved oxygen content and extraction yield. His lab mates had thought it was excessive. He'd quietly noted that it also made better coffee, so the point was moot. While the machine ran, he did push-ups. Not a set number. He'd stopped counting years ago. He did them until his arms felt warm and his mind stopped cycling through the previous night's thoughts. And then he stopped. This morning it took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He noted that without judgment. Shower. Cold, then hot, then cold again. 45 seconds of each. Another habit from the field, thermal regulation. They'd called it during SEER training, back when he was 22 and thought that the military had a clinical name for everything, because clinical names made hard things feel manageable. He still believed that, actually. It was one of the reasons he'd pursued the doctorate. He got dressed in what he thought of as his university clothes. Dark khakis, a navy Henley, a gray wool jacket that had seen better decades but still held its shape. He taught 2 seminars on Tuesdays and Thursdays, epidemiological modeling and a graduate-level course on emerging zoonotic pathogens, and had office hours Wednesday afternoons. Today was Monday, which meant the lab. He liked Mondays in the lab. Mondays had a specific quality of quiet that other days didn't. The graduate students hadn't yet ramped back up from the weekend, the department chair's emails hadn't yet reached their Tuesday peak, and the centrifuges and biosafety cabinets and PCR machines hummed along with a steadiness that he found, if not exactly comforting, then at least reliable. Reliable was good. Reliable was something he trusted. He poured his coffee into a battered stainless steel thermos, the same one he'd carried through 3 deployments, its exterior scratched down to raw metal in several places. and clipped his badge lanyard to the jacket pocket. Vanderbilt University Medical Center, Department of Infectious Diseases. Dr. Matthew T. Miller, Associate Research Professor. He looked at the badge for a moment, the way he occasionally did. There was a version of his life where that badge didn't exist. Several versions, actually, some of which had come startlingly close to becoming real. He kept the badge as a reminder that contingency and outcome were not the same thing. He picked up his keys, his bag, and the thermos, and he left. The walk, Vanderbilt Place. The walk to the university took 22 minutes at a comfortable pace, 34 if he stopped at the bakery on Vanderbilt Place, which he did on Mondays because the Monday croissants were made fresh and the woman behind the counter, whose name was Gloria, always asked about his research with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, which was rarer than most people realized. Morning, Dr. Miller. Gloria was already pulling a bag when he came through the door. Morning, Gloria. How's your grandson? 12 years old and already thinks he knows everything. She handed him the bag with a smile. Just like someone else I could mention. I know what I know, he said. It's a very specific and limited set of things. He crossed the Vanderbilt campus as it was beginning to wake. Maintenance workers, a few early rising undergraduates hunched over coffee cups, a pair of joggers on the oval. The trees had mostly shed their leaves and stood angular and black against the gray sky, which suited Matthew's sense of aesthetics. He preferred autumn to any other season. Things were more honest in autumn. The leaves stopped performing. Level 2 biosafety, 4th floor. The medical research building was a glass and steel structure that looked vaguely aggressive next to the older limestone buildings around it. Matthew swiped his card at the entrance, nodded to the security desk. Marcus, retired Metro Police, ex-Army, they had a shorthand, and took the stairs to the 4th floor. His lab was at the end of the corridor, behind a keycard access door and a second door that required a pin. Level 2 biosafety, which wasn't the highest designation he'd worked under, but still required the kind of careful habit that he'd found, over the years, aligned well with his personality. He flipped on the overhead lights and stood in the entrance for a moment, the same way he stood in any space he was about to occupy, taking inventory. 12 by 20 feet. 2 long benches, 2 biosafety cabinets, a biostorage unit against the far wall, a small desk piled with papers, and 2 monitors in the near corner. Everything where it should be. He exhaled. His current research project was something he'd been building toward for 3 years, a longitudinal study of pathogen adaptation mechanisms in orthomyxoviruses, the family that included influenza, with a specific focus on how certain subtypes acquired the ability to jump between host species with minimal intermediate mutation. It was, in the language of grant applications, foundational research with significant public health implications. In Matthew's own language, it was a question that kept him awake some nights. How does something that shouldn't be able to infect us suddenly decide it can? 10 a.m., the call. At 10, Matthew's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Area code 202. Washington. He let it ring. It rang again at 10:15. He answered. Dr. Miller. Not a question. A male voice, professional, the kind of neutral that was itself a kind of accent. The voice of someone who'd spent years speaking in rooms where tone mattered. Speaking. My name is Harold Fitch. I'm calling from the office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. We'd like to schedule a time to speak with you about some recent surveillance data. I believe you may have relevant expertise. Matthew leaned back in his chair slowly. ASBR, the federal office responsible for coordinating national responses to public health emergencies. He knew the office well from his time consulting on a biodefense task force 2 years back. What kind of surveillance data? He asked. The kind we prefer not to discuss over an open line. Is there a time this week you'd be available for a secure call? Wednesday afternoon. After 2. We'll send you the connection details. And Dr. Miller, we appreciate your discretion. The call ended. Matt held the phone for a moment, then set it face down on the desk. He turned back to his data. But the gel images looked slightly different now. Not different in any way he could have articulated, not changed in any objective sense. Just seen in a slightly different light. 2. Part 2. The shape of things. Noon, the fountain bench. He ate lunch alone, which was his preference on days when he had a lot to think about. A sandwich from the cart outside the medical center, a bag of chips, a second coffee from the cart on the corner, and a bench near the fountain in the Vanderbilt Square that was cold enough in November to guarantee solitude. The growth curves were the thing. He'd been tracking a particular influenza, a subtype, designated internally as NV7, that had been collected from a bird sanctuary in Louisiana 6 months ago as part of a routine surveillance sweep. The sample had come to him through a collaborative network he participated in, a loose consortium of university labs and public health agencies that shared avian pathogen data for research purposes. Nothing unusual about the sample itself, initially, but in culture, NV7 had done something unexpected. It had adapted, faster than it should have. Influenza viruses were famously mutable. That was the entire problem with them. The reason influenza remained a perpetual public health challenge despite decades of vaccine development. But the rate of adaptation Matthew was observing in NV7 was beyond normal drift, beyond anything he could explain with the standard models. He had run the sequences 3 times, had Priya run them independently, had cross-checked against every database he had access to. The numbers were the numbers. Now a federal health preparedness official was calling him, wanting to discuss surveillance data over a secure line. Matthew had been in enough rooms, in enough contexts, military and scientific and governmental, to recognize when separate data points were beginning to cluster. He didn't have enough information to know what the shape was yet, but he could feel it starting to form. Research note, NV7. Influenza, a variant collected from avian surveillance sweep, bird sanctuary, southeastern Louisiana, July. Exhibiting atypical adaptation rate across orthomyxovirus standard drift models. Hemagglutinin protein mutations, receptor binding sites broadening. Running designation, NV7. Afternoon, department corridor. At 4:30, he gathered his things to leave. In the hallway outside his lab, he nearly collided with Dr. Richard Holt, the department chair, a large, affable man with the energy of someone who had once been very athletic and now channeled it entirely into academic administration. Matt, just the person. Department of Defense inquiry came through the provost's office this morning. They're looking for faculty who have both relevant biodefense background and current active research in pathogen behavior. Your name came up. He paused. Twice, actually. What kind of inquiry? Consulting. Nothing formal yet, just exploratory. Something about working group formation. I'll keep that in mind, Matt said. 9:03 p.m., Elena Vasquez. At 9:03 p.m. his phone rang. Elena. Hey, she said. She sounded different tonight. A quality he'd learned to recognize. Careful. Hey, what's going on? I can't talk about this in detail right now. Not on this line. But I need you to tell me about the sample. The avian sample from Louisiana. NV7, he said carefully. Whatever you're calling it. What are you seeing? Because we're seeing something too, she said. And I think they might be the same thing. The apartment was very quiet. Wednesday, he said. I have a call Wednesday with ASBR. I know. I helped set it up. She exhaled. Matt, whatever they tell you Wednesday, be ready for it to be less than the full picture. Is that a warning? It's an observation. From someone who's been in a lot of rooms this week. Are you okay? I'm fine. Be careful. The call ended. Matthew set the phone down on the desk and looked at it for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked down at Commerce Street. The same city bus was on its route again. Different passengers. Same rectangle of yellow light on the wet street. He watched it until it rounded the corner and disappeared. 3. Part 3. Wednesday. Tuesday, the seminar. He slept, which surprised him. Not well, and not long. He was awake by 4, and the water stain on the ceiling was still Afghanistan, but he slept. He'd trained himself, over years and necessity, to sleep when sleep was available, regardless of what his mind was doing. The body kept its own ledger. After the graduate pathogen course, one of his doctoral students, Deshaun Washington, lingered after the others left. "Dr. Miller, can I ask you something that's not specifically on the syllabus?" Those are usually the best questions. If a pathogen was showing an accelerated adaptation rate, significantly beyond the standard drift model, what would be the most likely explanation? Matthew studied him. Deshaun was good, serious in the way that mattered. Most likely explanations, in order of probability: lab error, contamination, sampling artifact, and then, if you've eliminated those, genuine anomaly. And if it's a genuine anomaly, then you sit with that for a while and you do not jump to the most alarming interpretation. What's the most alarming interpretation? The one where the adaptation isn't random. Deshaun blinked. Not random how? Like I said, you don't go there first. You eliminate everything else first. Wednesday, 2:15 p.m., secure call. The call connected. Harold Fitch's voice was the same as on the phone. He was joined by two others, Dr. Okafor from NIH Biodefense Division and Colonel Sarah Ames from USAMRIID, the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. Matthew had heard of Ames. He'd also noticed that Elena was not on the call. "Dr. Miller, we'll be direct." "Please," Matthew said. "Over the past 3 months, we've been tracking an unusual pattern in avian influenza surveillance. The pattern involves an influenza, a variant exhibiting a non-standard adaptation profile. Our internal designator is Vector 7. We understand your lab has been working with a sample that may be related." Matthew's expression did not change. "NV7. I've been running it since July. We'd like to know what you're seeing." "I'd like to know what you're seeing first." Dr. Okafor spoke. "What we're seeing is a variant that is acquiring human receptor binding affinity at a rate inconsistent with natural drift. We're seeing it in 4 separate geographic clusters. The clusters don't have obvious epidemiological links." A pause. "We're also seeing early evidence of possible human exposure in 2 of those clusters." "Louisiana," Matthew said. "Yes, and Lombardy. I saw the ProMED reports." "The ProMED reports are incomplete," Colonel Ames said. "The human cases in Louisiana are now 11, not 3. No fatalities yet." Yet, he noted the word. Vector 7 briefing, confirmed facts. For geographic clusters, no confirmed epidemiological link. Human exposure confirmed. Louisiana, 11 cases, and Lombardy. Undisclosed 4th cluster, data withheld from working group. Pathogen exhibiting non-standard receptor binding adaptation inconsistent with natural drift. Wednesday evening, the sequences. He opened the encrypted transfer from ASBR. The comparative genomics file loaded the sequences for 4 external clusters and his own NV7 sample side by side. He stared at them. In genomics, the differences between sequences are usually where you look first. The mutations, the divergences, the points where one sample broke from another. But what caught Matthew's eye, what made him sit back slowly in his chair and look at the ceiling, wasn't the differences. It was the similarities. For clusters, for different geographic locations, 3 different countries, 1 undisclosed. No obvious epidemiological connection between any of them. And yet, across a specific region of the genome, a region responsible for some of the pathogen's most consequential behaviors, all 4 sequences had identical mutations. Not similar, identical. The same changes at the same positions in the same nucleotides. The probability of that happening naturally, by independent convergent evolution across 4 isolated populations, was not 0. But it was very, very low. He opened a new document and began to write. For himself, the way his advisor Dr. Ewan had taught him, write down what surprises you. One question stood out from the others, circled in the margin with more force than he'd intended. Working hypothesis, If the clusters don't share an epidemiological link, what do they share? 4. Part 4. What comes before? Age 22, Fort Bragg, 2010. He was 22 when he joined the Army. Not for lack of options. His grades would have gotten him into most universities, and he'd had a partial scholarship offer from the University of Michigan. But because he'd grown up with a particular relationship to usefulness, and at 22, the most concrete form of usefulness he could imagine was the one that put him somewhere difficult and asked something real of him. He was good at it. Not just physically, though he was that too, built for it in the way some people are, long and quick, and with a threshold for physical discomfort that his instructors at SOPC found notable, but in the less visible ways that turned out to matter more. Pattern recognition, situational calmness, the ability to take in a complicated environment quickly and identify the things that were wrong with it before his conscious mind had fully processed the information. His first deployment was Iraq, 2010. Second was Afghanistan. Then a third and a fourth, in places that were officially something other than deployments. He moved up through 5th Special Forces Group, spent 2 years with a joint interagency task force whose existence was managed carefully, and by the time he was 28 he had a clearance level, a collection of scars that had good stories and some that didn't, and a growing sense that the work he was doing, while necessary, was treating symptoms rather than causes. The turn, Khyber Province, Afghanistan. It was Afghanistan, the last time, that changed the direction. Not in the dramatic way that such moments are sometimes described, not a crisis of faith or a single defining incident, but gradually, the way erosion works, one thing at a time, over time. He'd spent 3 weeks embedded with a special operations medical sergeant, a man named Gutierrez who was running medical screenings in a village in Khyber Province, and he'd watched Gutierrez work and thought, this is also the work. The biology underneath the conflict. The thing that outlasted the fighting. He started reading, then studying. He took a long-distance course in medical microbiology during a 6-month period that included 2 operations he was not going to document here, passing his exams at a base computer terminal at odd hours. When he separated from active duty at 30, he had a plan. He finished his undergraduate prerequisites in 14 months at night school while working as a defense contractor. Applied to 3 doctoral programs. Got into all 3. Chose Vanderbilt because of Dr. Patricia Ewan, whose work on zoonotic pathogen emergence he'd read until the papers were worn at the folds. She made him reread every primary source. She made him defend every claim. She once returned a chapter of his dissertation with the word insufficient written and read across the title page and nothing else, and he'd gone home and run 8 miles in the dark and come back the next morning and done it better. He got his doctorate at 35, 1 year ago. The ceremony was on a warm May afternoon, and he sat in his doctoral robes on a folding chair and thought about Gutierrez in Khyber Province. He didn't know if Gutierrez would have considered this a continuation or a departure, but Matthew had decided it was a continuation, and he was going with that. Wednesday night, Claire. He called Claire that night. You sound like something's happening, she said immediately. Something might be starting. Define starting. I don't know yet. He was on the couch, the lamp on, the city quiet outside. Just wanted to check in. Matt, you're calling me on a Wednesday for no particular reason, which you haven't done since. I think you were overseas. I called you from overseas regularly. Exactly. He told her some of it. Not the classified parts. Those didn't exist yet, technically, but the shape of it. The data. The phone call. The question he'd written in the margin. Do you think it's serious? She asked. I think it's early. And I think serious and early often look the same, which is the problem. Be careful, she said. I mean it. Good night, Claire. Careful, Matthew. He hung up and sat in the quiet apartment. The city breathed outside the window. He sat in the dark for a long time before he moved. Part 5. The morning after Wednesday. Thursday, 5:30 a.m., the lab. He was in the lab by 5:30 Thursday. He didn't turn on the overheads. He worked in the light of the biosafety cabinet and his laptop screen, pulling up every file he had on NV7, organizing it the way he organized information before an operation, by what he knew, what he suspected, and what he needed to verify. He had worked in darkness before, literal and otherwise. 6:40 a.m., the transfer arrives. At 6:40, his laptop chimed with an incoming encrypted file transfer from the ASBR secure portal. He opened it. It was large. He started with the epidemiological data, the case reports from Louisiana, the Italian cluster, two others he hadn't heard of, a cluster in Guangdong, which matched the ProMED report he'd seen, and another in a location listed in the data only as Sector 7, Southwestern Region, undisclosed. The last entry had no country listed, no date of sample collection, and a handling classification he hadn't seen in civilian health research before. He looked at that entry for a long time. Then he opened the comparative genomics file, the sequences for the 4 external clusters, and his own NV7 sample loaded side by side. He stared at them. For clusters. For different geographic locations, 3 different countries, 1 undisclosed. No obvious epidemiological connection between any of them. And yet, across a specific region of the genome, all 4 sequences had identical mutations. Not similar. Identical. The same changes at the same positions in the same nucleotides. The probability of that happening naturally by independent convergent evolution across 4 isolated populations was not 0. But it was very, very low. Matt sat with that number for a long time. There was a word for what the data suggested, and he was not ready to say it out loud yet, because he was a scientist, and a scientist eliminated every other explanation first. But the word was there, waiting, sitting at the edge of everything he knew. The unknown caller. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. New area code, 703. Northern Virginia. He answered. Dr. Miller. A woman's voice. Precise, careful. Not Fitch, not Ames. Someone new. Who is this? My name isn't important right now. What's important is that you've just opened a file sent to you by the ASBR secure portal. And some of what's in that file, specifically the 4th cluster data, was not supposed to be in that transfer. Matthew was very still. So you're either calling to tell me to disregard it, he said slowly, or you're calling because you wanted me to see it. A pause. I'll be in Nashville on Saturday. The coffee cart outside the medical center, 9 a.m. Come alone, come casual. A beat. And Dr. Miller, do not discuss the 4th cluster data with the working group until we've spoken. The call ended. Matthew lowered the phone slowly. He looked down the empty corridor. He looked at his phone. He looked at the gray Nashville sky. The ordinary morning had ended. The something else had begun. Thursday, the lab corridor. He stood in the corridor for another 2 minutes after the call ended, which was not indecision. Matthew did not stand in corridors out of indecision. He stood there because he was doing something specific. He was cataloging what he had just learned, not from the words alone, but from everything around them. The woman had known he was reading the file in real time, which meant she had either visibility into the ASBR secure portal itself, which required either a high-level clearance or an exploit, or she had a source inside the office who was feeding her activity data. Neither option was casual. Neither option was someone who had simply stumbled into the wrong conversation. She had known about the 4th cluster specifically. She had not mentioned the Louisiana cases or the Lombardy cluster or the comparative genomics data, all of which were in the same file. She had gone directly to the one piece that had no country, no date, and a handling classification that didn't belong in a civilian health research transfer. That precision was its own kind of information. He put the phone in his pocket and walked back to his lab. Priya wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. He had time. He sat at his desk and opened a fresh notebook, the kind he used for private analysis, not the official lab notebooks that lived in the biosafety cabinet and were subject to institutional record keeping. He wrote 4 columns across the top of the first page. No. Suspect. Verify. Don't touch. The fourth column was something his team leader in fifth group had drilled into him during his second year in the field. Every operation had information you actively needed to avoid acting on before you understood its provenance. Acting on compromised intelligence was sometimes worse than acting on no intelligence at all. The fourth column was for things that looked like answers, but might be bait. He wrote fourth cluster, Sector 7 in that column and underlined it twice. Then he started filling in the first three. Private notebook, 4 columns. No, Vector 7 mutations are real. Elena's warning is real. The unknown woman monitored the file transfer in real time. Suspect, parallel response track exists. Working group is not the only room. Elena may be caught between them. Verify, NV7 sample chain of custody. Upstream handling. Maryland repository address. Don't touch. Fourth cluster, Sector 7. 8:30 a.m. Priya arrives. Priya arrived at 8:30. She came through the door with her bag over one shoulder and a coffee in each hand. She'd started bringing him one from the cart on the corner approximately 3 weeks into her postdoc, without comment or expectation of acknowledgement, which was one of the many reasons he considered her excellent company. You were here early, she said. It wasn't a question. Couldn't sleep. I need to pull the consortium transfer logs for the NV7 sample. The full upstream chain. Why? Because I want to know who touched it before us. Priya had a quality that he'd come to rely on. She asked the necessary questions and skipped the unnecessary ones. She gave him one beat of consideration and then said she could request the logs from the consortium data manager. Probably end of day. Route the request through the standard channel, he said. Don't flag it as urgent. Is it urgent? Everything is urgent. Don't flag it. 10 a.m., the NDA. At 10 a.m., he received an email from Harold Fitch, not through the secure portal, but to his standard university address. Brief and cordial. A reminder that the NDA was still unsigned. An expression of hope that Matthew would formalize his participation before the Tuesday call, and a line that read, with a careful friendliness, "We want to make sure you have everything you need to contribute fully to this effort." He read that last sentence 3 times. He wrote a brief reply thanking Fitch for the follow-up and indicating that he would have the signed NDA submitted by end of day Monday. This was a delay of approximately 72 hours, which would get him past the Saturday meeting. Cooperative in tone, without being either effusive or evasive. He sent it. Then he opened the working group membership list again. 7 names. Johns Hopkins virologist, UW computational epidemiologist, Colonel Ames from USAMRIID, 3 others from NIH, CDC, and a defense-adjacent institute in Maryland. Elena Vasquez was not on the list. He read it again to make sure. She was not on the list. He sat with that for a long time. 7. Part 7. The Sutler. Thursday, 6:45 p.m., Murphy Road. The bar was warm and crowded in the way that Nashville bars on Thursday evenings were warm and crowded. Not chaotic, but well-populated, with the specific ambient noise level that made conversation at a table effectively private, which was another reason he'd chosen it. He arrived at 6:45 and took a corner table with his back to the wall, which was automatic and did not require thought any more than breathing required thought. At 7:12, Elena Vasquez walked through the door. He felt something release in his chest that he hadn't entirely realized was held. She was in Nashville, which meant she was either here for him or here for something related to what he was inside of, and either way she was present, and that was information. She looked like Elena, compact, precise, with the kind of watchful stillness that she carried everywhere and that most people mistook for reserve. Dark jacket, no bag, which told him she'd either come from nearby or she'd been planning to be unencumbered. She scanned the room in 3 seconds and found him. She slid into the seat across from him without a greeting, which was also Elena. "You didn't sign the NDA," she said. "Hello to you too. I'm serious. They flagged it this afternoon when it went in signed." Fitch noticed. "Good. I want Fitch paying attention to me." Elena's report. She looked different tonight. dark circles that hadn't been there 4 months ago in Atlanta. Her jaw set in the way it set when she was managing more than she was saying. "You're not on the working group list," he said. "I know. Why not?" "Because 6 weeks ago I submitted a field report to my director that included a preliminary hypothesis about the Louisiana cluster that apparently made some people uncomfortable." "What was the hypothesis?" "That the index case wasn't where they said it was." Matthew was quiet for a moment. She had gone to Baton Rouge. She had interviewed the family. The symptom onset was 4 days earlier than the facility reported, which meant the case was either not linked to the processing facility at all, or someone had adjusted the timeline. What does his travel history actually look like? That's the thing. His medical records were transferred to a federal hold within 72 hours of his hospitalization. I've been doing this for 9 years. I have never seen records transferred that fast. Usually it takes 10 days minimum. Someone accelerated it. Someone had it ready to accelerate, which means someone knew before the hospital did that this case was going to be significant. She had put the observation in her report, not the conclusion, but the timeline inconsistency and the transfer anomaly. Her director had called her 2 days later and told her to revise the report. Remove the timeline section. She had submitted a revised version. She had also kept the original. "Is that why you're not on the working group?" "I think it's why I was offered a different role. I'm designated as a field liaison for the Louisiana cluster, which sounds significant until you realize it means I'm responsible for collecting clinical update data from the state health department and forwarding it to SBR. I'm a relay point. They took me out of the room where the analysis happens and put me in a corridor. They sidelined you. They managed me. It was a distinction, and he caught it. Before she left, they sat for another hour. Not planning. It was too early for plans, too little information, too many unknowns. What they did was compare architecture, what each of them knew, where the shapes of it overlapped and where they diverged. Before they left, Elena put her hand flat on the table between them, not touching his, just there. "The woman on Saturday. Be careful what you give her before you understand what she wants." "I know. I mean it specifically, not generally. She's going to offer you something. Information, access, a framework that makes sense of what you're seeing. And it's going to be genuinely useful." A pause. "That's what makes it complicated. Stay in the lane you can verify. Don't let her move you somewhere you can't see the ground." That's good advice for most situations. Most situations aren't this one. She stood, pulled her jacket straight, and looked at him for a moment in the specific way she looked at him sometimes, the one he had never found a precise word for. Then she walked out. He watched the door close behind her and sat with the shape of everything she'd told him, arranging it in his mind before sleep, not trying to resolve it, just holding it in its proper configuration so it would be there, intact, when he woke. 8. Part 8. Friday 6 a.m. Transfer logs. He was in the lab at 6. The consortium transfer logs had come through the previous afternoon. He spread them across his second monitor and began to work through them. The NV7 sample had originated at a bird sanctuary in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, a private wetlands preserve participating in a USDA-affiliated avian health monitoring program. Initial collection by a licensed wildlife veterinarian, Dr. Carla Fontaine, June 14. Shipped to the consortium's regional processing hub in Baton Rouge on June 16. Aliquot, and distributed to 3 recipient labs on June 21, Vanderbilt, LSU School of Veterinary Medicine, and a third listed as Consortium Reference Repository, Maryland, a building and room number he didn't immediately recognize. He wrote down the Maryland address. Then he went back further. The original collection report from Dr. Fontaine listed the collection location as a specific section of the sanctuary, the North Marsh, near what was described as Area 7N. He read that twice. Area 7N. He thought about the 4th cluster's designation in the ASBR data, Sector 7, Southwestern Region, undisclosed. He wrote both notations in his private notebook and drew a line between them. Then he wrote a question mark at the end of the line, because a nomenclature similarity was not evidence of anything. And he was a scientist, and a scientist did not follow the sound of words toward conclusions. But he kept the line. Morning, Priya's call. Priya appeared in the doorway. The LSU lab, she said, without preamble. I know the postdoc running the influenza work there. We were in the same cohort at a summer institute 3 years ago. I called him this morning. Off the record. What did you find out? Their NV7 aliquot showed the same adaptation pattern yours did. But they stopped running it 6 weeks ago. Their PI got a call from someone at the regional hub asking them to pause work on the sample pending a review of the collection protocol. They were told it was a standard audit. Was it? He doesn't know. The audit paperwork never came through. They've just been sitting on it. Someone quieted the LSU work, he said. But not ours. He told Priya to document everything. Every run, every result, every instrument reading. Copies in 3 places. And he told her what he told her carefully, not to discuss what they were finding outside the lab. Not with colleagues, not with department administration, not with family. If at any point you want to step back from this, tell me. There won't be any consequence to your position here. I'm not stepping back, she said. Flat. Certain. He nodded. Then let's run it again. Afternoon, Deshawn's paper. After the seminar, Deshawn Washington lingered again. He was holding a printout. The title, Directed Adaptation in RNA Viral Populations. Evidence for Non-Stochastic Mutation Patterning Under Selective Pressure. Published 14 months ago in a journal Matthew knew. Lead author affiliated with the Zurich Institute for Molecular Virology. He read the abstract standing in the seminar room. The paper proposed a theoretical framework for a process by which RNA viral adaptation could be accelerated and directionally guided through the application of specific molecular pressures. Not gene editing in the conventional sense. Something more subtle. Environmental manipulation that exploited the virus's own error-prone replication machinery to steer it towards specific mutational outcomes. The authors called the process guided stochastic selection. Where did you find this? Literature search for my dissertation background chapter. The experimental section. How robust is it? The cell culture data is solid. The in vivo modeling is thinner. But the theoretical framework is, Deshawn stopped, searching for the right word. Uncomfortable, Matthew supplied. I was going to say compelling. Both. He told Deshawn to follow the citation trail and document what he found. In personal notes, not the lab system, and to come to him first before sharing anything through university channels. He left the young man in the seminar room with the particular expression of someone who had just understood that the assignment had changed in character and was deciding, in real time, whether that was something they could live with. 9. Part 9. Saturday morning. Saturday, 8:40 a.m., the coffee cart. He was at the coffee cart by 8:40. The cart was a fixture, a converted silver trailer on the edge of the medical center campus, run by a man named Pete, who remembered everyone's order after 2 visits and never asked how anyone's day was going, which Matthew had always considered a superior form of customer service. He got his coffee and stood near the corner of the cart with his back to the building wall. In the ambient movement of weekend morning hospital campus foot traffic, nurses changing shifts, families walking in from the parking structure, residents in scrubs moving with the particular exhausted focus of people at hour 20 of a 24-hour stretch. He watched the approaches. At 3 minutes past 9, a woman came around the corner from the direction of the parking structure. Somewhere in her mid-40s, though she carried herself in a way that made age difficult to fix precisely. Medium height, dark coat, hair pulled back. No bag. She was scanning the space with a practiced efficiency that was controlled enough that most people wouldn't recognize it for what it was, but he did. She found him in approximately the same time he'd found Elena 2 nights ago. She walked to the cart, ordered coffee without hesitation, and came to stand beside him at the corner. Dr. Miller. Not a greeting. A confirmation. You have me at a disadvantage, he said. My name is Soren. That's not the name on my badge at work. but it's the name I use for conversations like this one. All right, Soren. What do you do with the other name? The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Things that are further up the chain from this conversation. What Soren knows. She was looking out at the street, not at him, in the way that people who didn't want to be observed having a conversation looked out at the street. The fourth cluster. Sector 7. It's a coastal wetland zone in western Louisiana, approximately 40 miles from the bird sanctuary where your NV7 sample was collected. It's been under passive environmental surveillance for the last 18 months, managed by a federal contractor with ties to 3 different agency contracts. The surveillance reports go to a routing address that, on paper, belongs to a Biodefense Research Coordination Office. In practice, the reports are read by 4 people, 2 of whom are not employed by any agency whose name you would recognize. He stood with his coffee and did not move. The samples from Sector 7 show the identical mutation profile as NV7 and the 3 other clusters. The Sector 7 samples were collected 11 months ago, before the Louisiana Bird Sanctuary collection, before the Lombardy cluster, before Guangdong. 11 months ago puts it in December of last year, before any of the official surveillance data that ASBR is working from, which means someone had access to a Vector 7 precursor nearly a year before the first cases were officially recognized. The nonprofit, who collected the Sector 7 samples. That's where it gets complicated. The collection was performed under a research permit issued to a nonprofit organization. The nonprofit's public-facing mission is wetlands conservation. Its funding comes from a mix of private donors and a small number of foundation grants. And its actual mission? I don't know that yet. What I know is that the mutation profile in those Sector 7 samples is not random. The paper your student brought you yesterday, the one on guided stochastic selection, is relevant. The coffee cart hissed with steam. Someone walked past them close enough that Matthew felt the air move. You know about the paper, he said. I know about Deshaun Washington, yes. He's a good student. He found something real. How long have you been watching my lab? Long enough to know that you're the right person for this conversation. That doesn't answer the question. No, she agreed. It doesn't. The arrangement. What do you want from me, he said. 2 things. First, your continued analysis of NV7. Not only for the working group, for me, in parallel. What you find, you share with me before you file it through official channels. And the second thing? Access to the Zurich paper's citation trail. Specifically the upstream citations that connect the guided stochastic selection framework to its experimental precursors. There's a paper in that trail that I believe was deliberately retracted 18 months ago under pressure from a source I haven't yet identified. He was quiet for a long moment. The hospital campus moved around them. In exchange, he said, I want to know who the 4 people are who read the Sector 7 surveillance reports. I can give you 2 of them. The other 2, I don't have confirmed identities. I have descriptions. Give me descriptions. One is a man, mid-50s, senior federal employee, has been in the same position for 9 years by his own engineering. The position was written around his profile. The second is a woman. Academic background, originally medical research, moved into what's been described to me as a coordinating role that has no clear org chart location. What does a coordinating role with no org chart location actually do? Connects people who are not supposed to know each other, and disconnects people who are getting too close to things they're not supposed to see. Condition: Matthew will work the parallel track only if Elena Vasquez remains in the loop. Everything he knows, she knows. Soren agrees, after a pause that is itself informative. I'll have the first comparative analysis ready by Wednesday. How will you get it to me? The same way you got my attention. You'll hear from me. The corner of her mouth moved again. This time it reached something closer to actual. You're going to be difficult, she said. I'm going to be careful. There's a difference. She pulled her collar up against the November cold and walked back toward the parking structure. He watched her go until she rounded the corner, and then he watched the corner for 30 more seconds. The way he watched corners. and then he turned and walked back toward the campus. X. Part 10. The Shape Sharpens. Saturday afternoon, the library. He spent Saturday afternoon in the library, not his lab, not his apartment, but the medical center's main library, in a reading alcove on the third floor that had a window overlooking the courtyard and enough ambient noise to think inside. He brought his private notebook and a printout of the Zurich paper in 3 hours. The citation trail from guided stochastic selection ran backward through 7 papers over 12 years. He followed it systematically, noting each source, its methodology, its claims, its own references, flagging the ones that deserved closer reading. By the second hour, he had a map of the intellectual genealogy, where the theoretical framework had come from, how it had been built, who had contributed each structural layer. And then he hit the gap. It was in a footnote in the third most cited paper in the trail, a reference to a study, number 23 in the bibliography, that described early experimental work on selective pressure manipulation in avian influenza. The reference was complete. Authors, title, journal, volume, page numbers, year. 2021. A journal he knew. He searched the journal's database on his laptop. The paper didn't exist in the archive. He searched the title directly. No results. He searched the authors. One of them had a publication record he could access, and within that record there was a gap, a 3-year gap between a 2020 paper and a 2023 paper, in a researcher who had been publishing consistently for 12 years prior. The kind of gap that could mean sabbatical, or illness, or departure from the field, or retraction and professional suppression. He wrote the author's name in his notebook, Dr. James O'Yelleran, last affiliation listed as the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control in Stockholm, and circled it. The picture. Then he sat back and looked at what he had. A theoretical framework for directionally guiding viral adaptation, developed over 12 years, with a critical experimental link in the middle that had been removed from the accessible record. For geographic clusters with identical mutations that had no natural explanation for their identity. An original sample site, Sector 7, identified 11 months before any official surveillance recognized the problem. A nonprofit with a conservation cover and funding that didn't fully account for its operational capacity. An index case with a timeline that didn't match its official origin story. Records pulled into a federal hold at impossible speed. And somewhere in all of it, a coordinating function with no org chart location, connecting things that weren't supposed to be connected. He was still eliminating alternative explanations. He was trying to be a scientist about it. But the alternative explanations were getting very thin. He closed his notebook and looked out the window at the courtyard below. A pair of medical students were sitting on a bench in the November cold, laptops open, close enough together that their shoulders touched. Normal. Ordinary. A perfectly ordinary Saturday afternoon on a university campus. He thought about the morning routine he'd run through 6 days ago, the alarm that hadn't woken him, the ceiling stain that looked like Afghanistan, the coffee ritual, the walk to the bakery, Gloria asking about his research, the city bus, the yellow rectangle of light on wet asphalt, the quiet before, the unknown text. He stood, gathered his things, and walked out of the library into the cold afternoon. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out. A text. Unknown number, different from Soren's. A Nashville exchange. A single line. Dr. O'Yelleran is in Chicago. He'll talk. He read it twice. Then he wrote back. Who is this? The reply came in under 10 seconds. Someone who found the retracted paper. Asked Soren how she knew where to find it. He stopped walking. He was on a sidewalk between 2 university buildings, students moving past him in both directions. He stood there, very still, and let the implication of that settle over him. Soren had told him the retracted paper existed. She had not told him how she knew. She had also known about the Zurich paper and about Deshaun Washington and about his private notebook, and he had not yet asked her how she knew any of those things either. He had been careful. He had been methodical. He had been doing everything right. But he was now receiving information about a person Soren had not mentioned, through a channel Soren had not given him, and the information concerned the retracted paper that was central to whatever Soren had just recruited him to investigate. Elena's voice in his ear. Be ready for it to be less than the full picture. He put the phone away and stood in the cold for a moment longer. The picture, it turned out, was considerably larger than any single frame he'd been given to look through. The organization he was starting to see the edges of, the one that had collected samples 11 months early, that had moved patient records at impossible speed, that had coordinates in Louisiana and Italy and Guangdong and an undisclosed sector, that had a coordinating function with no org chart location. That organization was still not named, still not fully visible. But it was getting closer to having a shape. And so was he. He turned up his collar against the wind and walked toward the lab. There was a flight to Chicago he needed to find, a man named O'Yelleran he needed to talk to, and a trail that was no longer cold. He moved, deliberate, controlled. The something else was fully underway now, and Matt had always been better in motion than in waiting.